Welcome to the Penultimate podcast. We have a name for it now. This was the name that we hated the least, I think, between the two of us. I want to thank my friend Burn Rourk for making the logo for us. And as always, to Brian and everybody at the destination for helping us make this a thing.
Yeah, including Brandon Jones, who is stuck editing this.
I'm glad you thought about that. We tried to make it as easy as possible and do it all in one take. I'm Rocko Jerome.
I'm Jeremy Hicks.
And we are here to talk to you today about a subject that's very dear to our hearts.
Is Valiant Comics dear to your heart?
Yeah, I would say so.
Okay.
Yeah, Valiant came around at a time when I was on the cusp of probably giving up on comics.
Okay.
And part of that was my age, possibly. But I think mainly it was just that comic books were starting to get pretty crummy right in there, by my estimation. I wasn't a big fan of the Rob Liefelds and Todd McFarlanes of the world. And there are many imitators. And I remember that Alan Davis had just left Excalibur. He had a great run on Excalibur where he was writing it as well as doing the art. And when he left, I found myself buying X-Force and whatever else. And I remember that there was a storyline called The Extinction Agenda or something like that.
Oh, yeah. It crossed over into all the X-Men books at the time.
And at that point, Claremont was gone, even. And I remember that I bought something twice. I bought a book twice without realizing, and that was like my sign as if to go ahead and bail on that scene, because I clearly wasn't getting anything out of it. You know, as I was going and not even remembering what I bought, buying the same thing again, that kind of thing.
I could be mistaken, but I think Claremont was still on Uncanny at that time.
I don't think so.
You don't think so?
No, I don't think so.
All right. This is where we could use like a fact checker.
Sure.
We need to bring on a third wheel who who can just do research.
My memory was that he did the first 4 or 5 issues of X-Men, regular X-Men,
right?
And then he was gone. And then Jim Lee was maybe gone at the same time or shortly thereafter. Was my remember of that. Right, my memory of that.
I stopped reading Uncanny shortly after Extinction Agenda. They had introduced Bishop, and I want to say Claremont was still writing it then. If Claremont wasn't writing X-Men then, who was writing?
I believe it was Fabian Nicieza.
Interesting.
I think.
Okay.
I don't know.
All right.
Either way, I wasn't fond of those comics at the time, and I was buying them out of habit.
Yeah.
And the situation back then for me was that my trip to the comic store would be, I'd go out with my mom for the day, and my mom was always very frugal. I came from a very frugal couple of parents who were very, very careful about what they did with their money, and that was a smart thing to do. But it meant that we would go to several groceries. We would go all over the place, and over the course of a 5-hour outing, I would get to have 5 or 10 minutes at the comic shop. And that would happen whenever it would happen. So I didn't even know that Wednesdays were a thing until I was much older. That Wednesday Comics was even the day that they would come out. But I was always way too late for Valiant. And I was seeing things that were interesting about Valiant that made me think that I would like them. So I went to the guy at the local comic shop and I said, hey, can you hold these Valiant books for me? Because I'm really interested in checking them out. And he was like, no, I don't hold books. Which actually it just meant that he didn't hold books for me because he didn't like me.
Yeah.
So I started getting books at another place, and I was into Valiant right at the time that Jim Shooter had just left.
So post Unity
yes.
is when
pretty much immediately after.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
So that gets us a little bit ahead of ourselves.
It does, but at the same time, I'm glad you mentioned that because I, too, am a big Valiant fan. And for me, my favorite era of Valiant is the pre-Unity books.
Yes.
You know, and I don't think it's a coincidence that the company went downhill after Shooter left.
Absolutely not. No.
Yeah, because I mean, he, and I'll touch on this in a minute, but he very much is the architect of Valiant Comics.
There's no doubt. Jim Shooter is one of the sharpest guys in all of comics, and he doesn't get nearly enough credit.
I agree.
Do you know the sort of the origin story of Jim Shooter?
To a certain extent, I know that when I started looking into this, there's some stuff that comes up, early on in his career, and there's actually a quote from his website that I'm going to read where he talks about, getting into comics at the age of 13. And
right.
Yeah.
So the story there was that he grew up poor. And he was one of a bunch of kids. And I think his father was a miner or some goddamn thing like that. And he was in a situation where he was, 12, 13, 14 years old. And the family was doing something. I think maybe someone had died or something. And he took the rare trip to the barber to get a haircut, to look good for whatever it is that they were going to be doing. And when he was there, he saw all these comic books, and he had been a comic book fan when he was younger, as a lot of people were at that time. When we were kids, it was sort of unusual for a kid to be into comic books. It was sort of one of those things where it's like very much a sort of a niche kind of a thing, and it still is today. But back then, all kids read comic books, including Jim Shooter when he was a young boy. So he sees all of these sort of tattered Marvel comics, right, which were then new. And he was looking at them and saying, like, I wonder if these are good or interesting or where comic books are now. And he was really blown away by how far they had come. You're talking about between the late 50s and the mid-60s for Marvel Comics.
Yeah.
This real renaissance was happening. And he was really taken with those comics. And then he looked at the DC books that he remembered. And he noticed that they were pristine. No kids had been picking up Superboy. And when he looked at Superboy, it was the same shit that it had been when he was a kid. So he said to the barber, what's going on here? Which ones of these do kids like? And he was like, by far, it's these ones with the weird art and the Spider-Man and the Hulk and all this stuff. And he had the presence of mind at that age to say, I bet the DC guys would like to be able to make comic books that sell as well as these Marvel books, and I bet I can help them get there. And I bet there'll be money in it for my family if I do that. So he started sending in scripts and stuff to DC for Legion of Superheroes that were miles away better than anything that they were doing, right?
Yeah.
So he gets called in to New York City by Mort Schlesinger, who was the editor at the time. And he shows up in a suit and tie, and Mort comes and hurries him into it in like a Snoopy shirt, right, coming off the bus.
Mm-hmm.
So he gets him in, and he's like, okay, look, here's what I need from you. Can you do it? Can you meet these deadlines? This is what a comic book script needs to look like. And he did it. And that was his entry into the business. And the way that the business culture at DC at that time was very much suit and ties and guys who thought of themselves as hacks, who did not take pleasure in what they were doing, right? And their attitude about the Shooter kid was, he's making us look bad. Because he had this kid that has all these ideas.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he was, I think that continued on throughout his entire career.
Yeah.
And I mean, really still does to this day.
Right, yeah.
So this all starts with Gold Key Comics and Jim Shooter. Gold Key Comics was an imprint of Western Publishing, also known as Whitman Comics. Gold Key operated from 1962 to 1984. Just some of their original and licensed titles included Dr. Solar, Magnus, Robot Fighter, Mighty Samson, The Occult Files of Dr. Spectre, Space Family Robinson, Turok, Son of Stone, Buck Rogers, The Man from U.N.C.L.E., Star Trek, The Twilight Zone, and numerous titles based upon Hanna-Barbera characters, Walt Disney Studios, and Warner Brothers animated properties. Their staple of writers and artists included Russ Manning, Paul S. Newman, Jerry Siegel, Dan Spiegel, Len Wein, Frank Miller, and Walt Simonson. Jim Shooter was Marvel Comics editor-in-chief from 1978 to 1987. The following is from Jim Shooter's website, jimshooter.com, and this touches on some of the things that you were talking about. I did my first professional comics work at the age of 13, selling a Legion of Superheroes story to DC Comics and going on to write Superboy, the Legion of Superheroes, Superman, and other titles. In 1978, I accepted the position of editor-in-chief of Marvel Comics under the condition that I would be allowed to improve things for Marvel's creators. I introduced royalties and a spectrum of other incentives, rights, and benefits, attracting a who's who of talent. Later, I founded Valiant, Defiant, and Broadway Comics and was the principal creator of their characters and universes. So, like with what you were saying, I mean, it sounds like that he picked up on a lot of those hacks.
Right.
And he really, I guess, was turned off by that and tried to wean that out wherever he went.
At one point, he said that his experiences at DC were, like I was saying, suit and ties, very serious guys, drank a lot of Alka-Seltzer, that kind of thing. And he said that the Marvel crew, the people showed up like they were going to paint a house, and it was like Animal House all day. You had guys dropping acid, writing comics, didn't make any sense. And when he first started to take over at Marvel, and what really was the thing that took him into power, was that he got the adaptation for Star Wars. It was Roy Thomas's idea. There was a story that George Lucas had gone to Stan Lee to ask him if he wanted to do it, and Stan kind of blew him off. Roy Thomas was like, I've seen some of this stuff. This is going to be huge. We need to get on this. And Shooter listened to him, and they did it, and it saved their ass. They were right on the tip of bankruptcy in 1977 when they did the Star Wars adaptation. That was the thing that put Shooter on the fast track to becoming the main guy at Marvel for a long time.
Well, that's interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah, and it's one of those situations where, the saying, Stalin made the trains run on time?
Yeah.
Shooter made the trains run on time.
Yeah.
He made a lot of enemies out of guys who we think of as being some of the titans of the industry, but they sort of needed to have their nose bent. It was that sort of a situation.
And you could make the argument that is seriously lacking in comics today.
Oh, it absolutely is. Are you kidding me?
I mean, you and I have complained before about how, nothing can kill our enthusiasm for a comic like delays.
Right. And with Shooter, it came out every 30 days.
Yeah.
And, are you familiar with the series Marvel Fanfare? Like, you've seen those quarter bins. Marvel Fanfare was made up of sort of random stories about different characters. And all of those had been put together for Jim Shooter to be fill-in books. So if somebody missed their deadline on Spider-Man, or even if they were coming close, they could say, fuck you, we're going to run this guy's. We already bought it. We'll run it. And you don't get paid this month.
Always good to have a contingency plan.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, look, man, I've been a manager of people. To me, a guy like Jim Shooter is not bad. I mean, I didn't work for him. I don't know. This is just outside looking in. And also, it's a little bit of a situation. When I started reading comics, when I first came into comics, Marvel was my big thing initially, like most kids.
Yeah.
And it was the Shooter era all the way.
Yeah.
And, I mean, I think that he has a good sense of how to build a universe, really.
Oh, yeah.
And how to sort of make characters bounce into each other the right way. He's just a really sharp guy. He's just a really, really smart guy.
Yeah. Well, that does not begin to cover Jim Shooter's story. You could dedicate a whole podcast to just Jim Shooter.
Yeah.
Golki Comics as well. But you cannot tell the story of Valiant Comics without both of them.
Right, sure.
So in 1987, Jim Shooter is fired from Marvel Comics.
Right. And at the time that he was fired, he thought they were going to give him a raise. They called him into the office, and he thought he was about to get a raise, and instead they fired him.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Long story, he tries to purchase Marvel with some investors for $81 million, but that doesn't go his way. And after another bid to purchase Harvey Comics, well known for characters like Richie Rich and Casper the Friendly Ghost, he decides to make his own company called Voyager Communications.
Right.
Shooter was a huge fan of Golki Comics, especially Magnus Robot Fighter 4000 AD. He goes to the owners of Gold Key and makes a deal for the rights for their entire stable of characters.
Right.
Soon enough, Shooter finds himself the proprietor of such legendary Gold Key characters as Magnus, Turok, Son of Stone, and Solar, Man of the Atom,
Right.
resulting in the eventual backbone of Valiant Comics.
That's sort of the big trifecta. And the thing about that, too, that's important to note, is that when you were talking about the titles that Gold Key did,
Yeah.
like Man from U.N.C.L., Star Trek, that was the kind of thing that made Gold Key Gold Key. Like, the superhero characters of Gold Key were very much C-list types of characters. Like, there weren't a lot of kids that were, like, running to the store so that they could pick up the latest issue of Magnus.
Oh, yeah.
Even though it was a neat book, and Russ Manning is nothing if not a very talented artist. But, like, nobody's really clamoring for those characters.
Oh, yeah, no, and when I come across back issues of Gold Key now, I mean, I especially come across the Hanna-Barbera stuff, the Walt Disney stuff,
Yeah.
and the Warner Brothers
That
stuff.
was the stuff that kept that was what Gold Key really kind of a jumping on point. And it was one of those situations where, since they were something that not a lot of people were paying attention to, they were allowed to be weird in a way that successful books and successful properties all the way around aren't really allowed to be.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, speaking of licensed properties, as Valiant begins their quest to join the ranks as a comic book publisher, a deal was struck between them and video game giant Nintendo.
Right.
Valiant decided to buy the rights to publish several Nintendo characters, including Super Mario Brothers,
Right.
Metroid, and The Legend of Zelda.
Right, yeah.
Long story short, it fails.
Uh-huh.
While Valiant would produce Nintendo comics until late 1991,
Yeah.
they decided to distance themselves from their failure
Right.
and focus on publishing the Gold Key properties.
Right.
Finding most of their money squandered, the comic publisher set down to produce their superhero line with nearly no money available.
Yeah.
With the pressure on, Jim Shooter sits down and writes a story arc titled Steel Nation for Valiant's first book, Magnus Robot Fighter.
Yeah. And the thing about Magnus that's interesting, they also did, going back real quick, they also did wrestling comics. They did WWF comics as well.
Did they really?
So they had WWF comics and Nintendo comics. Two groups of people that aren't really well known for reading. Right? So, and yeah, I always kind of wonder if Jim Shooter was thinking about opening a vein during that period of his life, too. Because that's real. Probably not, because he's so like a alpha type A kind of a cat.
Yeah.
That probably not. He probably was like, I'm going to get him. But Magnus was something that was dear to his heart. And one of the things that was really interesting about Magnus, especially to Jim Shooter, and I think in general, is that it's not the apocalyptic future.
Yeah.
It's very easy to do the apocalyptic future. It's not as easy, especially in comic books, a very visual medium, to do a series of comics that are about what seems like a sort of a heavenly ideal world and what's going on.
A utopia.
A utopian sort of a situation, and what the problems are there.
Yeah.
And Steel Nation was about the robots starting to develop a sense of self-awareness that they had not previously had.
Yeah. Well, Magnus was created by writer-artist Russ Manning,
Right.
and first appeared in Magnus Robot Fighter 4000 AD #1, published by Gold Key Comics in 1963. And here's where we'll kind of get into the original series and then Shooter's version of Magnus. Originally, Magnus is set in the early 41st century in the city of North Am. With a few exceptions, North Am covers every available square foot of North America.
Right. So it's
So think Fritz Lang's Metropolis.
Right.
Robots and artificial intelligences are an integral part of daily life, and few question the arrangement, but some do. One dissenter, oddly enough, is 1A, an ancient robot. In order to prevent mankind against renegade robots and to provide an example of a different way of life, 1A takes an orphan boy he calls Magnus and trains him in his secret Antarctic refuge. 1A teaches him how to destroy renegade robots and implants a device in his brain that allows him to eavesdrop on communications between robots. As an adult, Magnus returns to Northam, where he becomes friends with an influential senator and his beautiful daughter, Legia. Along with various robotic themes, Magnus and the people of Northam are sometimes menaced by the Goths, the residents of the lowest levels of the city. Legia describes the Goths as criminals and antisocials who resent all upper-level people, basically establishing that the paradise of Northam has a dark side.
Right.
The last issue, 46, was published in January 1977. However, Manning only completed 21 issues. The rest were reprints of previous issues or new stories by others. So that was kind of the original interpretation of Magnus. Did you ever read any of that old stuff?
I did, yeah. And Manning as an artist who appeals to me a good deal. He's got a very clean style, or had a very clean style. Everything was very elegant, I would say.
Yeah.
Manning's style, and really, I think he's kind of underrated. I think that there's a certain sort of a dynamic explosiveness to his work that was not completely unique to him, but it was something that you didn't see as much of as you may have liked. And it was an interesting view of the future, because it was a lot of the sort of the UFOs, flying objects, circular types of things, but there was always something to it that was sort of tingled the imagination in a sort of an off-kilter way. Yeah.
It one thing that stuck with me is that a lot of the Gold Key covers were painted covers.
Yes.
So I always thought that was cool.
Some of them have almost like sort of that pulp novel sort of luridness to them, which is very nice.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So as the flagship title for Valiant, Magnus Robot Fighter debuts in early 1991 and begins as a nearly seamless continuation of the original Gold Key run, and yet the characterizations are completely different. Right. Shooter wrote or co-wrote with David Lapham and others the first 20 issues of the series. During that time, he both deepened the theme and came up with a clever twist to Magnus's biography. The thematic change was both simple and profound. The rogue robots of the 1960s were now free will robots, and foremost among them was 1A. In the first issue of the new run, it's established that there are approximately 10 million free will robots in Northam, and they're organizing. However, Magnus is reluctant to assume that all the free will robots are killers. By the time Still Nation concludes, Magnus extracts the robot communication monitor in his brain and declares himself a free man. Real quick, those early Magnus storylines were intended specifically to launch new sister titles for Valiant. Starting with Magnus 5, the comic became a flip book with the other story premiering the adventures of Valiant's first original character, a Japanese superhero named Rai. The miniseries within a series quickly became a fan favorite, and Rai would jump to his own book once the miniseries held within Magnus ended. Also, Magnus 12 is Turok's introduction to the Valiant universe.
Right.
So, similarities between the original Magnus run and Shooter's revival. I'm more familiar with Shooter's run. Mm-hmm. I think I can't remember what issue Unity the crossover picked up in with Magnus, but I want to say it was like in the mid-teens somewhere. So Shooter basically, like we were talking about earlier, scripted everything up to Unity and like shortly thereafter.
Right, yeah. Well, and from my own experience, I didn't get any of those previous comics. And in those days, trade paperbacks weren't so much of a thing.
Yeah.
So remember that they had a thing where they collected the first 4 issues of XO Man-O-War, which we'll get into.
Yeah.
But for the most part, I didn't know about those early books. I had a card set that had covers. Each card was a cover of all the books, and they had a brief synopsis. And for years, that was the only thing that I had. And then a few years ago, when the speculative market had calmed down and you're able to buy these Valiant books. Because at the time, like by the time that you're talking about, they were already becoming extremely valuable.
Yeah.
And this was during the death of Superman, and everybody thought they were going to buy 500 copies of Spawn #1 and put their kids through college and buy a Ferrari. And so the books were all really expensive. You didn't have the internet back then either, so you didn't really have a way. You had to know somebody that had them, first of all, and try to get them to sell them to you, which was nothing doing for me.
Oh yeah, no, and we'll definitely touch on the speculator market,
right. Yeah,
because Valiant definitely, unfortunately, played a role in that.
Yeah, it was massive. But speaking of Rye, being able to go back and read that stuff for the first time a few years ago was a very rewarding experience. I mean, I found those books to be every bit as great as I hoped that they would be. And Rye is one of the ones that stuck with me the most. I think that's probably one of the most put upon super heroic characters ever. The idea being that he's sort of the descendant of a long line of Ryes, right?
Yeah.
And things have gone bad in Japan, and everybody blames him for it, including his wife, who won't let him see the kid. And his father hates him. Everybody hates this motherfucker. And he's just going around with no shoes, just trying to do the right thing.
There's nothing worse than going around with no shoes trying to do the right thing.
Yeah, and nobody wants anything to do with you. Your woman won't talk to you. Your dad doesn't like you anymore. You got no shoes. Like you, Valiant had, I guess when I first became aware of Valiant was already at its pinnacle, really. Yeah, right.
And so, like you were saying, the pre-Unity stuff was hard to find because the print runs on some of those were so small.
Super low.
So by the time I even first learned of Valiant, they were doing ridiculously high print runs.
Sure.
And that's something else that we'll touch on.
Right.
But
it still felt like with Valiant, it still felt like you were, when a new Valiant comic would come out and you had it and you knew about it, it was like the same thing as the Jazz Age. You have something that's fucking cool. Not everybody knows about it, and you get to be one of the people that's in on it.
It has, the pre-Unity stuff. I still own, my pre-Unity books because, of course,
I have them all.
Yeah,
I went and got every single one of them.
Yeah, same.
And I don't think I paid more than $5 for any of them.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't. I have some autograph stuff.
Yeah.
That I paid a little more for. For example, I've got a Jim Shooter signed Magnus Zero.
Oh wow!
So yeah,
cool.
so I've got some stuff like that in my collection. I've got some gold editions, which we'll also touch on.
Nice.
But that stuff is still some of my favorite comics to this day. I mean, it really is.
Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah, and it's funny because so much of the post-Unity stuff will turn up in quarter bins. We'll just turn up at Goodwill.
Doesn't mean anything to anybody.
Yeah, it doesn't mean anything to anybody. But the pre-Unity stuff, this stuff's solid.
It is.
It still
really
holds
is.
up.
Some of the stuff I don't like as much as some people do. Let's continue with the narrative here.
Yeah.
I don't want to get ahead.
All right. So, while Rye is Valiant's first original character, the first Valiant comic to feature non-Gold Key characters would be a book titled Harbinger,
right,
which premiered 4 months after Solar #1. Harbinger tells the tale of Peter Stanchek, a young boy with extraordinary powers who goes rogue from his former mentor, Toyo Harada, who runs the evil Harbinger Corporation. Peter gathers together a group of young teens and goes on the offensive against Harada, hoping to bring down his evil organization once and for all. Toyo Harada is one of my favorite villains of all time.
Great villain, I will say that. Terrific villain. Did a lot of great stuff with that character.
Yeah.
The book Harbinger overall didn't really work for me. And I've thought about it, and I think I can tell you why. It's a book about kids, and Jim Shooter never was one. And he doesn't know how to write them. Right?
I mean, I guess I had...
Shooter always seemed to me like he was, dumbing it down.
Yeah.
Just never really worked for me. And the guy who was the artist, was that David Lapham?
It was.
Like, he was always just sort of like a competent artist at best. There was no real stylish flourish. There was nothing really outwardly exciting about his work. He was the best guy that Jim Shooter could get at the time to do as much work as he needed.
I mean, he was an instrumental part of...
he certainly was. He wasn't a bad artist, but he wasn't an exciting artist. And I just feel like Harbinger was the one where it all sort of just... all the weaknesses coalesced for me in Harbinger, and I didn't particularly love that book.
I guess the reason Harbinger stands out to me, besides Toyo Harada, is it. You had these teenage characters,
right.
And being a teenager at the time, the book there was. There was some, for lack of a better way of putting it, some teenage shit that went down the book. Mm-hmm. Like one of the characters...
yeah, somebody got knocked up, right?
Somebody gets knocked up.
Yeah.
Somebody dies.
Yeah.
I mean, it...
dies bad, as I recall.
What's that?
Dies bad. Is like, gets beat to death.
Oh, yeah, he got the shit beat out of him. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And then there's like an entire issue that's dedicated to them, like sort of mourning his death.
Right, yeah.
And so it was... compared to some of the other stuff I was reading at the time, it was heavy.
My problem may have been that I didn't read it until much later, because I couldn't get it. I didn't get it until it was collected in a hardcover.
Yeah.
When Valiant kind of came back.
Oh, yeah. So you picked up that hardcover release from 2007?
I do. I ultimately have every one of those early books, but in some cases I don't have the issues. I have trades.
Yeah.
Or hardcovers.
Oh, no, those hardcover editions that Valiant Entertainment released in the 2007, 2008.
Wow, it's hard to believe it's that long.
Yeah, those are nice. I've got the Exo Man of War one, and it collects the first, I think, 5 or 6 issues of that.
That's the fucking shit.
Yeah. But, so, and I'll get to this in the end, but, Valiant eventually, came back in 2012.
Right.
And they brought Harbinger back. They brought Toyo Harada back as the antagonist
and I like those.
Of the series.
I did like those.
And did you read Imperium?
I don't believe I did.
So, Imperium, for to give people some context, is essentially like Valiant's version of Dark Avengers.
Right.
So, as you'll recall, at the conclusion of the Valiant Harbinger revival, essentially the Harbinger kids pull off this was his name Edward Snowden, the guy.
Yeah.
They pull off this Edward Snowden type hack and release all of this information on the Harbinger Corporation, and it essentially, brings them down. So rather than, go out, Toyo Harada decides to go on the offensive, and Imperium is him getting together a collective of essentially bad guys, and them trying to reassert his power.
Are they called the Egg Breakers, like in the original series?
In the original series, and I also believe in the Harbinger revival, the Egg Breakers were kind of his, like he ran the school,
right.
Or the Harbinger Foundation, and the Egg Breakers were his students.
Yeah.
Imperium is, I think, maybe 1 or 2 of the supporting cast were Egg Breakers, but he brings in other characters.
Okay.
That sort of become this cabal of arguably evil characters. But the thing I liked about Toyo Harada so much was that, to me, he is in some ways like Doom,
right.
In the sense that I think he's a righteous guy. It's just the means,
right?
For him.
Well, you get that egg break. You know what that is? The Egg Breakers.
What?
The saying: if you're going to make an omelet, you're going to break a few eggs.
Yeah.
Which is like the classic, like G. Gordon Liddy.
Yeah.
Like, okay, well, this reporter is saying things that we don't like. We're going to have to slip an LSD pill inside of his Tylenol bottle and wait for him to take it and then zone out while he's driving.
Yeah.
We just have to. You got to break some eggs. So that was what that was.
Oh,
It's
okay.
like the egg breakers were like him raising these kids. Like, look, your mom and dad are nice to you, but one of these days you might have to kill them because we're doing something bigger here. Like that was what that was, and I always thought that was a clever use of that.
That is clever.
Yeah.
So again, like Doom, Harada, the ends justify the means.
Right.
And I guess I don't know what that says about me, but
it's escapist.
I think they're both. I think they're both sympathetic characters.
Right.
So back to Turok. He first appeared in 4-Color Comics 596 in 1954. A second 4-Color appearance. After a second 4-Color appearance, he graduated to his own title, Turok, Son of Stone, which was published by both Dell and then Gold Key Comics from 1956 to 1982.
Right.
The original incarnation of the character was a pre-Columbian Native American who, along with his brother Andar, became trapped in an isolated canyon valley populated by dinosaurs. While the writer-creator credit for the characters of Turok and Andor is disputed, Paul S. Newman is recognized as one of the title's earliest writers.
Right.
He's also credited in the Guinness Book of World Records as the most prolific comic book writer with more than 41,000 published stories, totaling approximately 36,000 pages.
Yeah, the ultimate yeoman, that guy.
He scripted Turok for 26 years.
Yeah.
Did you ever check out any of that?
Yeah, it's great.
Early Turok stuff.
Talk about a nutty concept. You know what I mean? I mean, that's just a fucking gonzo concept. Like, okay, we're going to have an indigenous guy, and he's going to wander off into a cave someplace with his buddy, and then he's going to come out where there's a bunch of fucking Tyrannosaurus Rex. And we're not really, that's it. That's what it is. This is what's going on.
And let's do it for almost 30 years.
Yeah. It's Land of the Lost many years before that,
The Valiant Comics revival is somewhat similar. Set in the American West of the 1860s, Kiowa Indian hunters Turok and Andor explore a cave in the desert. The cave leads to another dimension called the Lost Valley or the Lost Land, where they are menaced by dinosaurs and primitive tribesmen. More on the Lost Land later. So we were talking about the insane print runs of some of these Valiant Comics post-Unity.
Right.
From what I could find, Turok #1 had the most produced at 1,750,000 copies.
Right. Now let's stop and think about that shit for a minute now. That's a lot of fucking copies of Turok #1. You know what I mean? I mean, now the print run of like Time magazine is like 100,000.
Is it really?
Yeah, it's not very much.
Wow. Yeah, you got to love that chromium die-cast cover from
a million
Turok #1
of those.
I didn't bother to check what the issues were that exceeded that. However, when Turok #1 was released, it was #4 that month.
Right.
So there were 3 other titles that had produced more than that.
Yeah, it's a very different time.
What would you say is a large print run nowadays for a comic?
Oh, now, I mean, Spider-Man is something like 90,000.
That's it?
Yeah.
Wow. That is crazy.
Oh, yeah. I mean, like, the types of numbers that that books would get canceled for in the 80s would be considered total failures, or the tops that they get at this point. So, yeah, it's very different. Very different time.
Anyway, Magnus is a modest financial success, but is a hit with the critics. 3 months later, Solar, Man of the Atom debuts.
Right.
The original Dr. Solar, created by writer Paul S. Newman, first appeared in Dr. Solar, Man of the Atom #1 in 1962 and is Gold Key's first original character. He's a physicist named Dr. Philip Solar, who, while attempting to avert a meltdown of the nuclear power plant where he worked, absorbed a massive amount of radiation in the process. He survived and discovered that he had gained the ability to convert his body into any kind of nuclear energy. The series was canceled in 1969, with the final issue being 27, though it was restarted at 28 in 1981, but was quickly canceled again after only 4 issues. By the way, Magnus Robot Fighter resurfaced as a backup strip in 3 of the issues of the revival.
Sure, yeah. That was one of those times when... This has happened several times with, like, the Archie comics characters, like the Archie superheroes, like the Shield and the Fly. Like, every so often somebody will try to bring that back out again, and it never really works. But Valiant is one of the only times that you ever had a situation where somebody was like, hey, you know, I wonder what Dr. Funnybone is up to. And it actually worked, because usually it does not work, you know.
Well, interestingly enough, whenever Valiant Entertainment was formed around 2007, they retained all of the original Valiant characters. However, they did not retain Magnus, Solar, and Turok. Yeah. Shooter briefly released a Magnus and Solar miniseries at Dark Horse.
I remember that.
And I read that, and it was awful.
I didn't think it was awful, but I also didn't stick with it.
Yeah, it didn't.
I didn't hate it. I didn't love it.
Eventually, those characters ended up with. Man, why can't I think of that? Dynamite.
Oh, sure.
So
for now,
yeah.
I mean, it's just like the Shadow or the Spirit or any number of those types of characters who never really quite got bought out.
Yeah.
By anybody, who was always kind of dubious who they really belonged to in the first place.
Well, and that theme certainly came up with a lot of this research that I did on a lot of these early comic companies. It seemed like that there was always questions of ownership and who did what, and it's interesting.
I'll give you a story. For years, Blue Beetle.
Yeah.
Blue Beetle was a Charlton character.
Right.
And DC acquired the rights around the same time as Crisis. And they were not able to use Blue Beetle in cartoons for a long time, or at least they didn't dare, because the original contract for the radio show from like 1946 said this company owns the media rights to Blue Beetle in perpetuity. So it's 2004 and JLU cartoon is out. And they're like, we want to use Blue Beetle, but we can't because homeboy in 1946 signed a contract that said perpetuity. We don't even know who could sue us for this. But they could probably win because of this contract that's out there.
Well,
so it gets weird with that stuff.
In a future episode, we're going to talk about Captain Marvel, and that to me is kind of the pinnacle of just ridiculousness with legal, copyrights
and then from Captain Marvel
jargon.
Comes Miracle Man.
Absolutely.
So that's another weird one, but not to wander too far off the base here. But one of the things too that I would like to note is that, to me, Turok was it was the same character in my mind. The ones that you read in the old books was the same guy that was in the Valiant books, as far as I could ascertain.
Yeah.
But that was not the case with Solar.
No, it wasn't. And for better or worse, I sort of wrote a lengthy explanation of this because it is somewhat convoluted.
Right.
Like, having...
but man, you know what? That Solar book is... To me, that might be, and that was why that was sort of the main sort of gist of what made Unity what it was. I think that was very deliberately done, because I think that Solar book is great.
Well, I'm a huge Barry Windsor Smith fan,
right?
And he did a lot of the art, so yes. I mean it's beautiful,
right?
It's interesting because when people talk about these inevitable debates about who's the most powerful this, who's the most powerful that. Nobody ever mentioned Solar. So
That's because only smart people read Valiant, and they don't have those types of conversations.
So after I read this rather lengthy explanation of his powers,
Right.
I mean, to me, it really defines and definitively states how powerful he is.
Right. Well, and so the thing that I liked about the Solar book was that the main book was about this guy who just kind of like doesn't know what's going on, except for that he's God now, basically, and he's trying to figure out what's going on, what the deal is. And then in the center of the book is the stuff that's being done with Barry Windsor Smith.
That's Alpha and Omega.
Right.
Yeah.
And so Barry Windsor Smith is an extremely talented comic artist.
Yeah.
Who is mercurial, to say the least. And by this point in time, he didn't want to work for anybody, and nobody wanted him working for them. Like, he had burned through Marvel. I think he'd always just had a little bit of association with DC, and he was just like, fuck all y'all. Nobody's where I'm at. Like, he was like the Kanye of comic artists at that time. And Jim Shooter was able to speak his language somehow or another.
Well, that's interesting.
And get him back for this. So that was where he sort of started his thing, was in that Solar book. So as you're reading those books, that was some of the most rewarding comic book reading of my adult life, was being able to go back and get those Solar issues and read them and not quite know what was going on, because the stuff that Barry Windsor Smith was doing, you didn't really know how it fit in context-wise. But what you ultimately found out was that Barry Windsor Smith was doing the art for the story of how he ended up...
his origin story.
Getting irradiated and having this thing happen, and him destroying the fucking world.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? And then either creating the world that he now lives in, or blipping his way into it. He doesn't really know for sure.
So that was conveniently collected in a trade called Alpha and Omega,
right.
And it collected that those that sort of those back pages
I am so glad.
of the first 10 issues.
I am so glad that I did not read two separate trades, and I instead read each issue, because it was in the middle, as I recall. The Barry Windsor Smith stuff was like right in the middle.
You know what? You're right.
Yeah.
Yeah. You're right.
So like you were almost supposed to like take him out. I don't know what he thought we were going to do, Shooter. He was having us cut up our books and send shit in, and like, all these ideas that he had to fuck with our comics. But I thought that was the way of doing that, so that it was like, it was like Memento or something. I mean, it really was like a very interesting way to tell that particular story, especially. You know
what? I can't remember what was going on with that now, because wasn't there also in like each issue some sort of a pull-out like poster that if you put them all together, it created this giant poster?
Yeah.
So I mean, that's a hell of a lot of content for a comic book. You essentially get a main story, a backup story, and part of this gigantic poster.
Man, the deal with Shooter was he was in a place where he was like, fuck it, I'm going to do it the way I want to do it. And I'm going to make comics for smart kids. And I don't give a shit anymore. Yeah. Like, I'm going to make this fly.
So bear with me here while we barrel through this. I'm going to talk about the original incarnation, which actually I think I may have already talked about the original incarnation. And so we're just going to focus on the new premise and try and make it through his convoluted origins here. So feel free to jump in at any point.
Sure.
So jump forward 10 years and you have Valiant Comics restarting the series with a new premise. Scripted by Jim Shooter with art by Barry Windsor Smith, Bob Layton, and others.
Oh, Bob Layton. I forgot about how important Bob Layton was.
Yeah.
Another deal where he had been pissed off at Marvel. Like, he had all this stuff that he had done, and he wasn't pleased with where Marvel was putting him anymore, and he was like, oh, okay, I'll go work for this guy.
Really?
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
So, I guess people always think of Image Comics as the, sort of the punk of comic books,
sure.
where all these guys are tired of, the man and go and start this company.
Sure, right.
But I mean, it really sounds like that, Valiant was the original.
Here's the difference. Image was made up of guys who became like superstars by drawing like kids. And kids were like, I can do that, right? Like, you look at those guys, they're terrible storytellers. They had no way of putting a story together. but they could draw a really cool picture of Batman with his cape flapping behind him, or Spider-Man in a weird pose that nobody can do, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And that was like the hot shot shit that got them in a situation where people knew their names, right? So it was punk in that sense. You talk about 4 chords, like they knew 4 chords, that kind of thing. And they started their own company because they were, and I will give them this, they were like, hey, why are we getting fucked? Why are we letting them fuck us?
Yeah.
Why are we just doing it because all the guys before us did? Whereas the guys that Jim Shooter was kind of putting together were more kind of like the session musician type guys.
I can see that.
They were more kind of like disgruntled guys, maybe guys who didn't really get along. That was certainly the case with Barry Windsor Smith. Barry Windsor Smith, if you're listening to this, I think you're great. I understand why you were pissed. I understand why you would be disgruntled about those types of things. But that was kind of the thing with Shooter. Shooter was kind of getting like the old bluesmen together. You know what I mean?
It's a good analogy.
Right.
Yeah, it really is.
And he couldn't get B.B. King, but he could get Jelly Roll Morton. You know, like he could get a B-list guy. You know, no problem.
So we meet a young physics enthusiast named Phil Selesky. Like Shooter, Selesky was a fan of the Gold Key line, his favorite character being Dr. Solar.
Great that his name is Phil Selesky, by the way. None of this. We're not having a Bruce Wayne. We got Phil Selesky. Yeah.
I mean, he was a dork.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, Phil Selesky was very much just a dork.
Yeah.
Years later, Selesky and his colleagues were testing a new type of fusion reactor when an accidental breach threatened to obliterate the entire area. Selesky rushed to shut down the reactor, and while he succeeded, he was exposed to lethal doses of radiation in the process. Amazingly, the exposure did not kill him, but instead gave him the ability to manipulate all forms of matter and energy. He tried to use his powers for the good of mankind by attempting to destroy the world's supply of nuclear weapons. However, the U.S. government attempted to stop him, and their efforts caused Selesky to lose control of his powers, which in turn caused Earth to fall into a giant black hole.
Right. And that was all told in the good artist, Barry Windsor Smith, was the guy that did the hot shit there.
So here's where shit just gets really crazy.
Yeah.
I mean, and again, having read this years ago, I wasn't quite sure how all the pieces fit.
No, it was the way that it was laid out was so nuts.
I mean, it really was,
especially for the time. I mean, it was almost like. It's really trite to refer to things as being like Citizen Kane, whatever, but it was very much like Citizen Kane in the sense that they were throwing shit out there that had never really quite been done in superhero books.
Yeah.
Especially in the context of a superhero book, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you can talk about Watchmen all day, but Watchmen isn't really a superhero book. It's a parody of superhero books, and it's a different sort of a thing. But this was something where it was done within the superhero genre. And it was using guys in the medium that have been around forever, so it wasn't like there was anything brand new there. But just a great, underrated run of comics.
Yeah, no, yeah. I absolutely agree. And again, much like with Harbinger, I mean, really heavy shit.
Yeah.
And I just, wasn't getting that in other books. Don't get me wrong. I mean, some of my favorite comics came from this era,
right.
But Valiant was doing something that nobody else was doing at the time.
Right. And so important to note, while this was happening, Image guys were putting out like issue number 1, making $10 million, making issue 2 6 months later, making $400 million, not fucking with issue number 3. The Marvel guys were trying to figure out what the fuck they were going to do without the Image guys around anymore. Basically shitting themselves, not really understanding how to do anything. No book had a clear path. Nobody really interesting was working, as I recall. And Valiant was doing this shit.
Yeah. Well, I mean, when again, obviously you and I are a little biased here about this, but I don't understand when people talk about Miracle Man, when people talk about Watchmen, when they talk about Dark Knight Returns.
Right.
I would make the argument that you could put pre-Unity Jim Shooter Valiant in that same category.
Yeah, I think there's a case to be made for that. Yeah. The difference is Valiant was designed to be episodic and to continue to come out. It wasn't like a limited series kind of a thing. Yeah. And that's something that Watchmen had over it. And Watchmen was originally, we'll get into this, was going to be the Charlton characters.
Right.
And that was just going to be the first DC issues of Charlton characters. And they were like, no, we don't want you fucking with those. We're going to make toys of those eventually. We don't want you making anybody a pervert. Like, just make up something else for that. You know?
So, somehow, Selesky was thrown several weeks back in time. The guilt over his role in the destruction of his world caused him to split into two beings, Dr. Solar, who believed himself to be Selesky's childhood hero, and Phil Selesky, who retained all the memories of the original. Selesky sought to prevent the accident that gave him his powers from taking place. His efforts were complicated by the presence of Dr. Solar, who was convinced that Selesky was a dangerous criminal. Eventually, Selesky convinced his alter ego that they needed to work together, and the two of them fused with the past version of Selesky and prevented the accident. In the process, they discovered that Selesky's fusion reactor was actually a wish machine that allowed anyone within close proximity to change the universe in any way they saw fit. Before the original accident, Selesky wished that he could become his childhood superhero. As a result, the reactor simulated the events that gave the original Dr. Solar his powers. Selesky also found out that he did not travel to the past, but instead recreated his universe after falling into the black hole. However, this universe was now populated by a large number of superpowered beings. The revelations inspired Selesky to take up the mantle of his childhood hero, becoming known as Solar Man of the Atom. Essentially, Phil Selesky is the architect of the Valiant universe.
Right.
So, I mean, that's, that's just some crazy shit.
It is. Well, and, Shooter had kind of tried this before at Marvel with the new universe. Right?
Marvel has brought back some of those new universe characters in recent years. I don't know much about the original.
Okay, the new universe. The deal was there was a real strong. This is the shit they don't tell you, but this is true. There was a real strong possibility that Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko were going to come back, and maybe even Stan too, if he decided that he was getting tired of being fucked the way he was. That those guys are going to be able to break the Marvel Universe apart and say, we own these characters. Or at least we own a say. So the new universe was an idea where they were like, well, we better come up with something new just in case that happens so that we can pursue other avenues. And New Universe was sort of similar in a lot of ways, specifically in being that there was just like a few crazy things that happened. And from that came everything else. You had a lot of characters in the new universe who didn't have powers, or certainly didn't have the conventional concept of what powers were, except for like one or two guys who had some weird shit happen to them. And from that was the genesis of every other thing.
Did you have a favorite new universe character?
No, not really. I mean, it was kind of one of those things where like, I would get those in the quarter bins or dime bins or nickel bins.
Yeah.
And Star Brand was definitely sort of the dry run for that sort of concept of Solar.
Yeah.
But, I mean, it was the kind of situation where I don't think it was like destined to fail. But there's something about the new universe where it just kind of feels like they were keeping it in second gear.
Yeah.
Like there's definitely something about it that doesn't quite. And see, what happened too was that they only got like 3 or 4 issues in before it became clear that all that shit wasn't going to happen, and they were going to be able to hang on to the rights to those characters in perpetuity.
Yeah.
So they didn't really worry about it too much anymore. So they took the good creators off those books and put them back on X-Men or whatever the fuck.
One of my favorite writers is Jonathan Hickman,
Sure.
and during Hickman's Avengers run, he brought on board some of those new universe characters.
Yeah.
So, I mean, they were sort of bit players in it all, but having not known much about the new universe, it was interesting to...
Hickman's a sharp guy, man.
He really is.
Hickman's a kid who went through a lot of graph paper, I bet. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, there's a lot. His shit is dense.
Yeah, it really is.
It is.
But unfortunately, there's a guy who can't fucking get anything out on time.
No, I mean, that guy, I've never seen any video of him or anything, but I'm sure he's one of those guys that's like so smart that he's in a room with a chalkboard scribbling all the time.
I met him at C2E2 last year.
Yeah, how'd that go?
He's a nice guy.
Yeah.
Pretty down to earth.
That's
and
cool.
I think the guy in front of me in line had brought up some of his Fantastic Four stuff to get signed. Which, by the way, his Fantastic Four run is fantastic. I mean, I think it rivals John Byrne's Fantastic Four and even Kirby and Stan Lee's Fantastic Four.
Yeah.
Anyway, so the guy brings some issues up to him and is like, he asked him some question like, what did Marvel say when you came up with this, 4 or 5 year story arc? And he just kind of looked at him and he said, "They said thanks."
Nice. Very good.
So he seems to have a very dry sense of humor.
He had a neat, it wasn't called Nick Fury, but it was that Secret Warriors book.
That was fantastic.
That was good, yeah.
Yeah. That really was.
Yeah.
So, back to Solar. Solar 10 would introduce another new hero, an immortal known as Eternal Warrior. It also
Connor McLeod of the Clan McLeod, basically.
Yeah. It would also prove to be Valiant's first gimmick comic cover.
Right.
2 months later, Valiant launched their first company-wide crossover story, Unity.
Unity, yeah.
So, Unity. The Unity story...
Unity!
Is that some Chappelle show?
Yeah, man, yeah.
The Unity story comprises 18 issues and 9 comic book series.
Covers by Frank Miller.
Yeah, and Walt Simonson.
Right. Oh, was it Walt Simonson or was it Frank Miller?
Both.
Okay.
Both.
All right.
Yeah.
And they would make a poster if you had them all. If you laid them all out.
Yeah.
Once I finally had them, I laid them all out on my floor and just looked at them and was just like, I thought I'd get all those.
Again,
$4 each.
Again, Valiant and their quest to make gigantic posters.
Yeah.
So the Unity story comprises 18 issues and 9 comic book series published by Valiant during August and September 1992. The crossover would begin with a Unity 0 issue and would conclude with Unity issue 1. Fans and retailers alike were surprised by the news that the lead-off Unity 0 wouldn't cost them a dime, as the cover price said it all.
Yeah.
Free.
Yeah. Time is not absolute. That was some shit, man.
It was.
The guy at the comic shop, man, he was like, I'm not holding anything for you. I just like, it was just something that was happening.
Is this the same guy who you went on to later, basically befriend?
It is. It's Dog of Comic Book World. I'll go ahead and say. Yeah. I mean, I love the guy, but when I was a kid, and man, I was into good shit. I was into Alan Davis, Valiant, and Will Eisner as a kid.
Yeah.
This is when kids were coming in talking about like Rob Liefeld and shit. He just didn't like me, whatever. He was a kid. I probably wouldn't have liked me either as a little redheaded kid with a mullet coming in there.
Let's see. So, Unity tells of Erica Pierce, the Mother God, trying to rewrite reality and restore her original universe.
Yeah.
Erica works as a physicist along with Phil Selesky at Edgewater Nuclear Plant during the original near-explosion incident.
Yeah.
The same accident that gives Phil Selesky his powers also grants Erica powers.
Right.
Later, when Selesky accidentally destroys Earth and sends himself back in time, Erica is sucked back with him. Driven mad by the destruction and imperfect recreation of the universe, Mother God sought to repair reality by erasing everything and starting again with the time streams aligned. Unity is set in the Lost Land from Turok.
Yeah. And Erica Pierce was always drawn like a real thin-lipped, like just angry woman.
Well, and if memory serves, again, just some crazy shit going on with Erica Pierce. Like, if I'm not mistaken, she was a victim of abuse by her husband.
Right, yeah.
And ultimately destroys him.
Right, sure.
And I'm pretty sure that in The Lost Land, she ends up having an incestuous relationship with her son.
Yes, that's true.
So,
who is like this horrible, gross character. I mean, it's some crazy shit going on. But it's like, she's a believably angry and hurt person.
Yeah.
To where you have like some feeling of like, man, wow, jeez, it's too bad. You know, you're never pulling for her, but it's like she's pretty put upon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Again, you just you know at least for me at the time, and I think it's certainly much more commonplace now. I mean, just you weren't getting that kind of shit from Image, from DC, Marvel.
No.
You're rubbing the blood over at Image.
Yeah.
And here you've got this incestuous mother who survived an abusive relationship.
Yeah, this is heady shit. Yeah.
So Unity was considered the comic books crossover event, and soon Zero issues, chromium covers, gold logos, and signature series books were debuting month after month as Valiant continued to push the envelope.
Right.
The speculator's bubble was reaching its peak thanks to Valiant.
Yeah. Well, and going back and reading those comics for the first time, after sort of lionizing them and thinking about them and like, what do they like? What do they really like when you get to read them? That kind of thing. One of the things that I was always very taken with was at the back of each one you had like the letter from Shooter. Like a Shooter would chime in and tell you what was going on and, talking about building a universe. And you really, like, you got the sense because it was always like, you ain't seen nothing yet. He was always kind of playing it that way. And as you get into those Unity issues, all of a sudden Jim Shooter is not there anymore on those back pages. And instead you have other guys chiming in. You have like the business partner who's like, I'm just filling in for Jim this month. I want to tell you guys what I like about comic books. My brother used to like them. I preferred throwing footballs around. That kind of thing. And you sort of slowly, it started to dawn on you that there was a change in the wind.
Yeah, an abrupt change.
Very abrupt, yeah. And back then you didn't have the internet. So you didn't know, or you did, but it wasn't where it is now. And, you just didn't really get the stories of what was going on behind the scenes. You didn't have a blog or Twitter or any of that kind of stuff.
We were talking about it earlier, but one of my favorite Valiant gimmicks was the coupons that were redeemable for Magnus Zero and Harbinger Zero.
Right.
So with Magnus...
Did you do those? Did you cut those out and send them in? Or?
No, I did not.
Because one of the things that Shooter said, he was like, in one of those monthly things, was he was like, okay, we got the message. You don't like cutting up your comic books. We're never going to do that again.
No, what I years later when I pieced all this pre-Unity stuff together, I made sure that when I picked up Magnus 1 through 8 and Harbinger 1 through 6, I made sure that I picked up copies that still had the coupons inside.
I think at least one or two of mine are missing the coupons.
But I also made it a point to seek out as well, right. And like I was saying, that
I just wanted to read the fucking shit. I mean, it was just to me, it was like mana to finally get to read it.
Yeah,
because I didn't know anybody that liked comic books like I did when I was a kid.
Really, none of your friends did?
Well, I did, but they were not where I was.
I got you.
They were not where I was, and there was few of them, and they were just not. If any of you guys are listening, fuck you for not reading comic books more closely. And taking the occasional trip to the library to learn something about the history of the medium. But, I didn't really have anybody to talk to about this stuff back then.
There was a difference between the coupons for Magnus versus the coupons for Harbinger. So with Magnus, again, issues 1 through 8 were originally produced with a sheet of trading cards bound inside, including a coupon printed for the send-away version of Magnus Zero. The cardboard set was stapled into the center of the comic and shows three character trading cards and a fourth card that is a coupon for Magnus Zero. Harbinger, issues 1 through 6 were originally produced with a slip of white paper bound inside showing a coupon printed for the send-away version of Harbinger Zero. The front half of the slip of paper explains the coupon redemption program, while the back half of the slip of paper is the actual coupon. And so we've mentioned Image, we've mentioned Rob Liefeld. So to a much lesser extent, do you remember the Valiant Image crossover Deathmate?
Oh God, yeah. Well, okay, wait a minute. We're skipping a lot of shit here. If we're gonna,
are we?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Well, first of all, what I was assuming that you had some material on this was that Jim Shooter was fired from his own company.
Oh, I'm getting to it.
Okay.
Yeah.
That was well before Deathmate, though.
Well, I sort of am lopping this in with the gimmick shit.
Okay.
Yeah. So
let's talk about Shooter first before we get into Deathmate.
Okay. Okay. So I've got this is actually. I mean, you talk about the best of times, the worst of times. Check this out. Yeah. So by the end of 1992, Valiant, which according to Shooter should always be spelled in capital letters, won its first of two Best Publisher awards. First award was for Best Publisher under 5% market share. Yeah. The following year, Valiant won Best Publisher over 5% market share, becoming the first and only publisher outside of Marvel and DC to ever win Best Publisher over 5%. And I couldn't really find out definitive information on this, but that's a feat that may still stand to this day.
Possibly.
Valiant was voted by retailers as Publisher of the Year, and Shooter won the Diamond Gemini Award for Lifetime Achievement, along with Bob Overstreet and Stan Lee.
Right. That's two huge names.
Yeah.
Overstreet, Prescott.
And so here it is. Within the next year, he would be fired. In 1994, after a period of tremendous growth, Valiant's venture capital investor Triumph sold the company to video game developer Acclaim Entertainment. In addition to publishing comics, Acclaim produced games featuring Valiant Universe characters such as Turok, Dinosaur Hunter. Yeah. So, I mean, to me, it's just I don't know. I feel really sympathetic for the guy because I feel like here's an artist.
Yeah.
Here's an artist, a man who has created this entire universe, this company, and just as soon as at its pinnacle,
right, he's
gone.
Well, it's what we consider its pinnacle now. If Jim Shooter had not been fired from his own company, I realize that I say a lot of things, and sometimes they may sound like overstatements. This is not one of those in my estimation by any stretch. Valiant would be where Marvel is today if they had not fired Jim Shooter.
That's a bold statement.
I believe it. I believe it. I mean, Marvel made its bones in this whole new world through fucking Iron Man, right? Iron Man was at that point no more or less of an obscure character than Magnus Robot Fighter or Solar or any of that shit. And I think that if he had been able to grow in the way that he was growing and continue to do what he was doing with Valiant, I think Valiant would have eventually found itself into that situation.
It for what it's worth, I still Valiant relaunched. We sort of talked about that, and continue to release comics to this day and are somewhat prolific with it. Right. And they get their shit out on time. Their books are some of the most critically acclaimed on the market, and nobody reads them.
Right? Yeah, they're not terribly popular.
I mean, do you read any of the revival stuff?
Not anymore. I mean, it was one of those deals where I was liking them, but I could tell that it's a very decompressed storytelling sort of a style. And I just had to drop something, and I dropped the Valiant books.
No, I understand.
And plus, it just felt weird, man, because I associate that stuff with Jim Shooter.
I can see that.
Yeah, and it's not like I don't think at any point they said "screw you, Shooter" or anything, but like, but it was just sort of like it was the kind of thing where Shooter didn't get to finish what he was doing with any of his characters, and I don't really love someone else coming along and retooling them.
Well, I dig some of the new Valiant stuff.
I do too, but I'm saying it's just like it's not something that I seek out.
I read what's his name, guy who writes Hal Jordan in the Green Lantern Corps, Robert Venditti.
Okay.
He wrote the first 50 issues of X-O Man of War for this revival.
50 issues, wow.
Yeah, I mean that's in today's day and age. I mean that's you don't get that every now and then.
X-O's what a great concept for a character.
And I really dug it. And now he left the book, and they have since relaunched it, and I dig what they're doing with it now. Okay. I mean, X-O Man of War is their flagship character.
Sure. Which really I think that is as it should be.
Yeah.
The concept of X-O Man of War is that he was a Visigoth who gets abducted by aliens who feed off of him for millennia, and then he finds a way to kick their asses and steal their crazy Iron Man style kind of, but it's a living being suit.
Yeah, the sentient. Yeah. It's the sentient kind of plant metal.
Yeah, it's a symbiotic
hybrid
kind of deal.
Yeah,
and it's just he comes to modern day world. I mean, what a great, and Barry Windsor Smith was the initial artist, and it's just like, man, this shit's crazy.
That there's the cover to the original X-O Man of War 5 is kind of the suit forming around him, and it's one of my favorite
incredibly
covers.
Iconic cover.
Yeah,
and the thing about that too was that Turok sort of a similarly like Gonzo concept, and those two characters became friends in the comic. But
yeah, I mean, of course, two warriors are gonna end up hanging out
and go kill
spider aliens,
dinosaur robots, and spider aliens. But Shooter getting fired from his own company. I mean, it's, and you can see how. I mean, I'm not saying that there was no good Valiant Comics after that, but you could tell that they sort of like they used the rest of his ideas, and then things started to.
It's very watered down
a bit, yeah, because it just wasn't hitting the same way.
I completely agree with that.
Yeah.
Now, this new Valiant revival, I think, it has really nothing to do with either the pre or post Unity stuff. It's an entirely new interpretation.
It's something else. It's not even the same.
But
Shadow Man was a character that I liked a lot.
Yeah,
Shadow Man I think is a concept that probably could be done in a heavier and a darker, more far out way, because the concept of Shadow Man was that you had a jazz saxophonist in New Orleans,
right,
who tries to have a one night stand with a woman who turns out to be an alien who bites him, and it flips him out, and all of a sudden, like at night, he can see and he starts to become a different person. Like this whole crazy thing happens with Shadow Man,
and I mean, and who hasn't been there?
Yeah, right. Things happen. But I think that was a concept. That's probably one of the concepts from Valiant that I would like to have seen done in a little bit to more of a full contact kind of a way.
A lot of these Valiant revival books that Valiant Entertainment have been putting out, none of them have really lasted that long. They brought back Shadow Man. It lasted, I don't know, maybe 10, 12 issues.
That particular one that didn't look like anything like what I would have done with it, and for that reason I didn't care.
Yeah.
And it didn't really bear. And the thing with Shadow Man too is that during the course of Unity, he found out that he was going to die in 1999.
Right.
And another thing that Valiant used to do that I thought was cool is it worked in real time.
Oh yeah.
Like when you would buy the book, it would be like, you buy it on March 14th. And the book would start off like March 23rd, 10 o'clock in the morning.
Similar to how the original Hellblazer run was.
Like they're right on with that.
Yeah.
And you would like pick up a book where, like I remember that some of the first ones I was able to get was like an issue of Shadow Man where he was fighting a couple of guys who were somehow tied to Harbinger. And like, you know, he chopped off somebody's arm or something like that. And then they show up with their arm gone, like in the issue of Harbinger, where he's like, yeah, fucking guy cut my arm off. And it tied in like that closely. Like it was like the issue of Harbinger took place later in the same day as that issue of Shadow Man.
No, that's cool.
Real cool.
Yeah.
I mean, stuff like that.
I mean, insanely tight continuity.
Right. And you just had a situation where you were dealing with characters who were new and of the time, and you really don't have a lot of that. I mean, there's not been a lot of new characters at a Marvel or DC in the last 20 or 30 years who've really stood the test of time. And I've always said that characters make the most sense at the time that they were created, right? Yeah. Superman never is going to make sense as a guy who works at a fucking newspaper. It just doesn't.
Yeah.
You know, all these characters who their origins are tied to radiation. We know that now, right? Like it always
unless of course it turns out to be a wish machine.
Right. Well, yeah, but I mean, in that case, they had to work with what they had to work with. But you know, I mean, in most cases, I really do feel like comic characters, especially, they work best at the time that they were created. And this was very forward-thinking creations that were happening here.
Yeah. Some of the I sort of keep jumping back and forth between the pre-Unity stuff and then the revival stuff. There was I was trying to think of some other revival books that I checked out. You know, we talked about Harbinger, we talked about Imperium. There was, of course, Exo-Man of War, Shadow Man. They brought back Eternal Warrior.
Right.
I want to say that what is his name? It only lasted 6 issues, but when they brought Eternal Warrior back, whoever wrote that, those 6 issues were fantastic.
Yeah. And
again, nobody read it.
Right.
Yeah. I'm probably not doing anybody any favors because I can't remember who wrote it.
Well, there was Eternal Warrior, which was Highlander. I mean, 100% it was just Highlander.
Yeah.
They just made a comic out of it. Just stole the idea completely. And then one of his fellow Eternal guys was his brother, who was
Armstrong.
Armstrong from Archer and Armstrong.
Yeah.
Right. So, and one of the things too that I before we move past this period of Valiant was that okay, so I had a subscription to Wizard.
Oh yeah,
as you did.
Yeah.
And since I had a subscription to Wizard, I got some trading card of some Jim Lee bullshit, right?
He did the cover for, this is post-Unity, but he did the cover for Hardcore #1.
Right, oh, sure.
Yeah.
This wasn't Valiant related, though.
Oh, okay.
This was just like I don't even know what it was. I think it was like some Christmas character that he made up, like Jingle Bell, and like a woman who somehow is showing you both her ass and her boobs. You know what I mean? That kind of horrible art that he would do, just nonsense. God, I don't have a lot of love for those guys. But anyway, so had this trading card. It was deemed to be collectible. There was a comic book and trading card show at Basher Manor Mall with a bunch of booths of guys selling comics. And I remember that there was a guy who had Rye Zero.
Great issue. Right.
Which came after the end of Rye, after Rye had finally, mercifully been able to die.
This also a post-Unity book, but was
very much so.
Not released very long after Unity, but
yeah. So this guy had Rye Zero, and I remember he was a real creepy, like day trader kind of a guy who was getting into comics because he thought it was going to be a way to make a bunch of money.
Speculator.
And he has a booth, and he has Rye Zero, and he wants like $80 for it, right? And the book isn't even a fucking year old at this point, right? It's still pretty much a new book. What's $80 for it? Which is way more than I pay for a comic book now.
Oh, yeah.
I don't care what it is. So, I had this card, and I had my mom take me to the mall with this card. Like, I'm going to trade this card for a big deal Valiant comic. Like, this is going to be my thing today. And, like, I had tried to get, like, Unity 1 from somebody, but, like, Rise Zero, I had heard, was, like, the linchpin to the Valiant universe.
I mean, it was essentially sort of I've heard it described as the Bible of the Valiant universe.
Right.
Essentially what it was that it foretold the future of all your favorite characters.
Which I think they fucked themselves by doing, but let's put a pin in that and get back to it. So I go to this guy and I was like, hey, I've got this card, this Jim Lee card, and I want to trade it. He was like, well, maybe this Rise Zero. I got that for a good price, which meant that he bought all of them when they came out, and he had a stack of them underneath his table. But I managed to trade this stupid fucking card for Rise Zero and go home and read it. And I mean, it laid it out like by date. Like Shadow Man dies in 1999.
Yeah.
They didn't show you how that happened, but they showed you how Exo Manowar died. They showed you how, far in the future Armstrong was going to die. They showed you how Toyo Harada took over. And they really painted themselves into a corner with that. And it's not something I think Shooter would have done. But they put themselves in a situation where they laid everything out for their universe in such a way that they couldn't really create many new characters. Or they couldn't do anything unless they did some sort of time travel shit, which they'd already said they were never going to do, to undo that issue. So as an exciting comic book to have, it's tops. It's still one of my most exciting comic books ever. I love it. I think it's great.
No, I do too, and I will disagree slightly that I did not feel like that they were kind of putting themselves in a corner. I thought it was awesome that they were like, okay, this shit has real consequences.
So we're committing to it.
Yeah, I mean that's what I.
Dead was always dead at Valiant too. That was another thing that's important to note. They made a rule early on.
That may have even been like a saying.
It was, dead is dead.
Yeah.
Yeah. If a character dies, they don't bring him back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And again, you weren't getting that anywhere else.
Right.
So to kind of wrap this up, in 2004, after several major setbacks in their core sports gaming division, Acclaim Entertainment shut down and ceased all activities, including those involving Valiant.
Right.
In 2005, a group of entrepreneurs led by Dinesh Shamdasani and Jason Cothery raised financing and acquired the rights to the Valiant Comics library from Acclaim Entertainment's estate for just under $1 million, forming Valiant Entertainment. Shortly thereafter, a legal battle ensued with rival group Valiant Intellectual Properties, LLC. Ultimately, Valiant Entertainment won the dispute in 2007 and gained uncontested rights to the full Valiant library. In May of 2012, Valiant Entertainment began publishing new monthly comic books based on the Valiant Comics universe of characters. So, again, they brought back Rye, they brought back Archer and Armstrong. They even brought back some of the Acclaim books, like Quantum and Woody. Right.
Which was a late in the day one.
We started the show out 2 days ago talking about Fabian, and I'm pretty sure that Fabian created Quantum and Woody.
Yeah, really?
Yeah, I think so.
Huh.
Yeah.
One of the things that I think is important to note about, we had mentioned Death Note, or Deathmate, or whatever it was.
Yeah.
That was a big deal. That was what killed Valiant in the first place. And that was a big part of what screwed up the speculator market, which deserved to be, in my estimation, and also brought about some very dark days for comics.
Yeah.
And the contention was Valiant and Image were going to have this big crossover, and Valiant would publish one, Image would do the next.
Right.
Valiant, Image. And I think it was going to go back like that 4 times.
I think there was a total of like 6 books because you had a prologue and an epilogue, and they did the whole color thing instead of numbering. And
horrible idea. And what ended up happening was as we noted before, the Image guys were on their yachts. Like, they were getting their first taste of big money. They had no work ethic. They had no concept of get it out on time. And they didn't want to do that anymore. And by Valiant hooking their ship to that, that fucked everything up for everybody. Comic shops were ordering these books. The books weren't coming in. Valiant had actually put in a situation where they expected their storylines to tie in to this thing, and they basically just tied themselves to a rock and threw themselves into the ocean. It actually got so bad that Bob Layton went to Rob Liefeld's house.
Yep.
And camped out on his front porch and said, "I'm going to watch you finish your fucking pages."
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, ultimately, it was Liefeld's Deathmate Red that derailed the series. Right. Like you were saying, the Valiant guys got their shit out on time. The Image guys did not. But the most notorious, the most, the book that really, again, derailed it was Liefeld's Deathmate Red. I mean, it came out long after everything else.
It's one of those things where it's like, hey, I don't care what the Valiant guys are doing. If you take 50 pounds of chocolate ice cream and you mix it with 50 pounds of cow shit, you get 100 pounds of something that I will not eat. And that's basically what that was. And it screwed up everything for everybody.
Going back to C2E2 last year, where I met Hickman, they were getting ready to relaunch X-O Man of War again. So Valiant was there and had a panel, right. And Dinesh was there, and their current publisher, Fred Pierce, who was the former president and COO of Wizard Entertainment and was part of the management team for the original Valiant. I got to meet both of them, and walked up and introduced myself to Dinesh. And so the first thing he said was, "Did we fuck it up?"
Oh wow!
And I was like, and I kind of laughed, and I was like, no. And he was like, well, I know, I know how much this stuff means to, you original Valiant guys.
Yeah.
And he said, I'm an original Valiant guy. Right. That's why, we purchased this, was because we love these characters.
Those guys have a thing on their sort of their message groups where they like to check in and say, okay, how many copies of Magnus 2 do you have? And try to account for all of them. They're trying to account for all of the copies of those really low print run books that are out there.
Well, Mitch tells me that Valiant contacts the store, Mitch Harmon, the Destination, that Valiant contacts the store, I want to say monthly. It may not be monthly, but often enough to say, hey, how's our books selling? What's it going to take to get our books in the door there?
Wow.
And Mitch tells me nobody else does that.
I would imagine
no other publisher does that.
I was going to do that.
Yeah. So there seems to be a genuine love of these characters from these guys. And like I said, it's a shame that nobody reads this stuff because, it's actually good stuff. I get it. There's so much good stuff on the stands these days. But, again, they've brought about these original characters like, I want to say the character's name is Divinity. They brought about this character who's a Russian cosmonaut. That was a cool miniseries, and he ended up being incorporated into the Valiant universe. They brought Unity back, except instead of a crossover event, they brought it back, and it was essentially their Avengers team. Wow. So it was X-O Man of War, Ninjak, who they expanded his origin on, and he's actually, it's not Ninjak, it's Ninja K. So he's a ninja in a long line of other ninjas. Right. Sort of like how Wolverine
MI6 agent, if memory serves, too, right?
Yeah, yeah. So
that's an interesting angle.
Yeah, so similar to how like Wolverine is Weapon X and is a part of this, this.
It turned out it was Weapon 10 X series. Right.
Yeah.
Grant Morrison's run.
There's a character named Livewire who's part of it, and she's a very cool character. She interacts with machines and computers. Eternal Warrior was part of the team, right. I can't remember who else, but it lasted a surprising 24, 25 issues. And
now when you hear
good.
about a book going for that long on one run, it's crazy. That's it's so sad that we're at a point where that's like a monumental. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
They cancel Spider-Man at 10 and relaunch it the next month with number 1. You know.
All of those, I mean, I can't even keep up with how many relaunches Marvel has done in the last 5 or 6 years.
Many.
Well, this is obviously the longest pod that we've had, but I mean, I think this is something that was very near and dear to both of us.
Yeah, certainly, man. Valiant's a big deal, you know, and it's sort of one of those things where I don't think of it often. Things that are from the period of my life when I was like, 12 to 14, during those really awkward years, are things that I don't really think about that much now. But it was a lot of stuff. I mean, I was really into Doctor Who and Mystery Science Theater 3000 and Bruce Campbell movies and things that later have become like the biggest things in the world. But at the time, it was like, nobody seemed to care, at least in my bubble.
Well, and this definitive version of Valiant's history.
Right.
I mean, there's a lot of characters, both pre-Unity, post-Unity, and then even with the revival that we didn't even touch on.
Sure.
I guess for me, I just felt like that the Gold Key characters were the backbone of that original universe.
Certainly.
And Dinesh was saying that because of course the Gold Key stuff came up when I was talking to him and Fred, and he said that people ask about it all the time. Obviously, Dynamite has the rights right now, but he said that if there were ever a way to bring them back, that they would certainly do it.
Well, those sands are ever shifting, so there's always a very good possibility that could eventually come to pass, that it all be under one roof again.
Yeah. Anything else you want to add before we wrap this up?
No, I think we did it, man.
Does it feel good to be back?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Penultimate podcast.
We sort of started the show and just kind of jumped right into this, and for those of you that are listening, we've actually been away for a couple of months. Not even all of the original episodes have been released yet,
right.
But so it doesn't seem like we've been away for you all, but in fact we've been away for about 2 months.
Yeah, right.
So,
right.
But I guess that's all I've got. So if you want to take us out.
All right. Thanks for listening.
Later.